Hey there, welcome to the Bible in 5. You are going to be reading in the Eat This Book plan the Gospel of John for about the next 2 weeks. And so we're going to take 2 videos here to deal with the Gospel of John. You'll notice right off that the Gospel of John is very different than the other 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's because the materials that went into the making of the other 3 Gospels tended to be shorter stories. You notice that there were maybe like 3 or 4 stories or teachings of Jesus in a chapter. The Gospel of John is very different. The Gospel of John is very much, the materials that went into the making of John are different sources and different eyewitness materials that went into the Gospel, but also the storytelling style of the author is very different. The chapters tend to be a little bit longer, and Jesus teaches and talks in the Gospel of John more than any of the other Gospels. And so the story begins here. We'll just deal with the first half. It begins not with a story about Jesus. It begins with a long prologue from the author telling you about Jesus' identity. And it does so by using Jewish imagery and wording and ideas taken right out of the Hebrew Bible. So the first sentences of the Gospel of John are retelling the story of Genesis 1, the story of creation. Except Jesus is introduced, not coming onto the scene in Nazareth of Galilee. Jesus is introduced as someone who is present and actually the one who shares the identity of God as the creator of the universe. Jesus is introduced as the creator of all things, right in the first sentences of John. So the Gospel of John has a very high view of Jesus' deity and his relationship of the Son and the Father that gets played out in the storyline. And so you're introduced to Jesus' identity. He's the revelation of Yahweh, the creator and redeemer God of the Old Testament, in the story of Israel. And so the story gets started here in the first half, in chapters 2 through 12, and each of these chapters, almost to a chapter, is a long narrative where Jesus comes onto the scene and he teaches or does a miracle or something, does a sign, and it causes controversy, or people begin to wonder who he is. And then Jesus takes that controversy or that teachable moment and begins to talk about who he is and what he came to do. That pattern is replayed over and over and over again. He comes onto the scene, does something, people wonder who he is, and then he uses that as a moment to explain who he is. So in the first 3 chapters, chapters 2, 3, and 4, there are 4 stories about Jesus taking 4 common Jewish symbols, ritual purification jars at a wedding. He has a long conversation with a rabbi. He goes to the temple in Jerusalem, and he goes to a sacred well north of Jerusalem. And he encounters people at each of these places, and he uses their misunderstanding of him as the Messiah and Son of God as a moment to talk about who he is and what he came to do. So these are Jewish symbols that he is using to explain who he is. In chapters 5 through 10, Jesus ends up going to Jerusalem, or it's different times of year, and there are 4 Jewish feasts that are mentioned here, or sacred times like the Sabbath, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or Passover, or the Feast of Hanukkah. And Jesus has some sort of confrontation, or he does a sign or a wonder, and he uses, and people wonder who he is, and what he does is he uses the language or imagery of these ancient Jewish feasts to explain who he is. So he is the light of the world. When Jesus says that, he's in Jerusalem celebrating the Feast of Hanukkah, which lights were lit as part of that celebration. And so he taps into Jewish imagery and the Jewish feast, to explain who he is. So this is a very powerful section, long explanations of who Jesus is, what he came to do. It's all connected to Old Testament imagery and so on. The first half of the gospel, it comes to its kind of climactic point here in chapters 11 and 12, where Jesus raises his relative Lazarus from the dead, and then also forgives a woman who was a prostitute. And these 2 actions cause huge confrontation with the Jewish leaders. And again, that confrontation allows Jesus to explain who he is and what he came to do. And these chapters, these confrontations with the Jewish leaders, essentially set off the events that are going to happen in the rest of the gospel. These chapters summarize years of Jesus' actions. These last chapters of the book, the last half, just summarize basically like a week and a few days. And so it's this confrontation here that launches Jesus into his final week, which we'll cover in the next video. But these stories are meant to be read and reread and reread. The language and themes all repeating here in the story. Themes like people are a witness to Jesus. Themes like, do people believe in Jesus or reject him? This is all language and motifs that Jesus uses. He borrows the name of I am, of Yahweh from the Old Testament, and he uses that name to describe himself. There are 7 I am statements throughout the Gospel of John. And Jesus, again, he's the revelation of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament in human flesh. So these are powerful stories to be read and reread, prayed over, meditated over, to help you understand Jesus' identity and who he is and what he came to do. So powerful reading. We'll jump into the next half next week. So off you go to read the Gospel of John. See you next time.